About a month ago, I watched Isao Takahata's Grave of the Fireflies for the very first time, and I've never consumed a piece of media that's made me feel the way that film has made me feel. For weeks, it stuck with me. I felt like I was grieving the loss of a loved one after coming out of that film, and it led me to becoming obsessed with the history of this film. I ended up delving into the original story it was based on by Akiyuki Nosaka and getting deeper and deeper into his backstory and the actual true story that was behind Grave of the Fireflies. And in this video, I'm going to go through some of the books that I've read, the research, some of the media that I've read regarding it, and go over the true story of Nosaka's life that influenced Grave of the Fireflies. Let's take a look. It's well known that Takahata's Grave of the Fireflies is heavily based on the semi-autobiographical work by Akiyuki Nosaka. And the thing that strikes me the most, however, is that Nosaka decided to create Grave of the Fireflies as a sort of apology to his younger sister Kiko, who died during World War II under his care. And much of that work is supposed to be an idealized version of how he wishes he conducted himself and how he treated his sister during the firebombing air raids that were occurring while he was growing up. So to start and really look at the true events that happened versus what was idealized in Grave of the Fireflies, to start, Nosaka was actually a foster child who lived with his maternal aunt Aiko and his sisters Kiko and the other sister. Unfortunately, there's not a lot written about, nor could I find much even as far as a name goes in terms of her background. So for the purpose of this video essay, I'm going to essentially focus on Nosaka and Kiko's relationship based off of what I was able to gather. I actually got a lot of my research done through David C. Hall's work in Victimization and Responsibility, which is a fantastic essay that I recommend reading. I also looked at Alex Dudok DeWitt's book on Grave of the Fireflies that he wrote for the British Film Institute, as well as some interviews from An America that were based upon Nosaka's time working with Takahata on Grave of the Fireflies. In David C. Stahl's essay, he does probably the best job I could find in highlighting the actual chronology of what happened to Nosaka during World War II, from basically start to finish all the way up until Kiko's death. And one of the most pronounced differences that Stahl talks about is the actual event of the air raid as it was portrayed in Grave of the Fireflies, and how different it was from the story, the film, and the actual account of what really occurred. For Nosaka was that, unlike the film where Seita takes Setsuko and runs somewhat heroically to save his sister during the air raids, didn't actually occur. What ended up occurring was that Nosaka, after seeing how bad the fires were getting and how terrible everything was becoming, ran to save himself, while his mother and sister took shelter underneath the floorboards inside their home. As Stahl cites, however, Nosaka ended up running into a hillside bomb shelter on his lonesome, and he ended up hanging out with, ironically, a 4 or 5-year-old girl, according to Nosaka's account, and sat there with her and spoke with her for about a half hour before he ended up taking a look at the destruction that ended up destroying pretty much all of his home and everyone he knew, all of their homes as well. So it was about several hours or so, according to Stahl, that Nosaka ended up meeting his family in an area where I believe they had agreed would be a spot to meet in the event of an emergency. However, upon his arrival, he didn't end up finding anybody, so he started looking around and found that the National Elementary School, which was, as I understand at this time, one of the only buildings left standing after this catastrophic event, he found both his mother and sister there. However, his mother had ended up being severely burned, with Kiko, as I understand based off of Nosaka's account, having been unscathed following this. A handful of days later, Aiko was transferred to a hospital where she was met with Nosaka's grandmother, Koto, who helped tend to some of her injuries, while Nosaka and Kiko moved in with relatives living in an area somewhat close to this hospital. An interesting thing, however, that I want to mention is that unlike the Grave of the Fireflies short story or even the film, his mother never succumbed to her injuries. She ended up living quite a long life, as I understood, but Nosaka himself has kind of blurred those details throughout his time writing, and in some cases mentioned that his mother had passed away and that he was an orphan, and other times downplayed it. And it wasn't until some of his later works that he confessed that his mother, Aiko, never actually died, and during this period, Nosaka would commonly visit from his relative's home to his mother and bring food and try to help with the laundry. However, he stated that he couldn't stand the constant bickering between Koto and Aiko, and also couldn't bear to continue seeing some of the horrible conditions that were going on in this hospital at this time period. Where we get some more core similarities in the chronology of Nosaka's life versus his short story is that Nosaka and his sister Kiko lived with a widow and her daughter Kyoko, who was, as I understand, a little older than Nosaka. And it's a little blurry here because, as I understood, these were relatives, but in some stories and accounts it was that Nosaka was living with essentially a widow who knew his relatives. But as I understood, Nosaka wrote quite frequently that he was infatuated with Kyoko, and at some point, and this is again a substantial difference between the short story and the actual true story of what occurred, Nosaka claims that he barely paid attention to his sister when Kyoko was around, which, as you can recall in the film, it was essentially just about Nosaka and his sister. However, he didn't completely forget about his sister Kiko, and whenever there was an air raid siren going on, Nosaka would immediately, just like in the story, strap Kiko to his back and run to the bomb shelter in Niteko Pond, and Kyoko would often join them at these times, according to his account. And at that time, Nosaka talks about how they did have enough food, and very similar to how Seita goes back and grabs food, he did the same thing in real life and ended up grabbing a large provision that he had left to him by his foster father that was buried in their garden at their home that unfortunately got firebombed. However, this amount of food, according to Stahl, was quickly exhausted, and Nosaka and his sister had to get by on tiny rations of rice and even food that he stole and other things that he was able to forage. The problem that Nosaka discusses, however, is Kiko was not old enough to chew and swallow some of the harder foods that he was able to find, and oftentimes Nosaka himself would be so deprived and so starved that he confesses that he would often eat most or all of her share just to himself. And of course, just like in the story, Kiko ends up starting to suffer from malnutrition. As time progressed, Kyoko was sent to basically work at a nearby factory to help with the war effort, while Nosaka and Kiko ended up moving into the pondside bomb shelter just like in the film, and they stayed there for about a month. Now, where this gets blurry is in the Grave of the Fireflies story, we learn that the reason Nosaka and Kiko, or Seita and Setsuko, leave is because of a disagreement with the aunt and her treatment of them. However, Nosaka doesn't really give a clear guideline as to what triggered him to moving into this poolside bomb shelter. However, there is some implication or assumption that Koto, Nosaka's grandmother, ended up having some sort of argument with the widow or the family that he was staying with, and as a result, he ended up moving out completely. And so, there's not a whole lot of core detail here. I'm not certain, and there's no evidence to back up that the reason Nosaka left was exactly like how it happened in the film. However, what did happen was that him and his sister did live in this bomb shelter just like in the film. Now, where this gets more fascinating is Nosaka and Kiko, and keep in mind at this junction, Kiko's health was deteriorating quite drastically, and in some instances, there's a lot of discussion about how Kiko essentially was becoming more and more difficult for Nosaka to handle. In some instances, Nosaka regrettably even admits that he would beat his sister to get her to stop crying, and it's something that for him he carried a tremendous amount of guilt about throughout his whole life. And at this time as well, it was implied that Nosaka frequently, to try to survive, would commonly steal. He would try to find food wherever he could, and he justified his 2-year-old sister as the reason that he did this. The problem, however, is Nosaka claims that even in the moments where he would find fresh fruits or vegetables or forage food for him and his sister, he would frequently leave her with next to nothing or almost nothing at all to feed her and give her some sustenance at her age. And the most obviously awful portion to this is, just like in Grave of the Fireflies, Kiko got to a point, according to Nosaka, where she could not even lift her arms and barely even open her eyes. She was so malnourished. One of the things that is far different, however, from the actual story and the real life events that occurred in Nosaka's life is that Nosaka ended up evacuating this bomb shelter with Kiko. So she would have been alive, and according to most of the accounts I could find, did not die in this bomb shelter. But she was alive at this junction, and Nosaka brought her to an acquaintance's house that he doesn't give very much details about in the Fukui Prefecture. Shortly after Nosaka and Kiko arrived here is when Kiko unfortunately ended up starving to death and passing away. And according to An America, in the interview that they conducted with Takahata and Nosaka, Nosaka states, and I'm going to read this word for word, "My sister's death is an exact match with the novel. It was 1 week after the end of the war." Now, what's fascinating is I'm not certain exactly what Nosaka means as it being an exact match, other than I'm assuming that the process in which his sister died and the way in which his sister died was what he means by it being an exact match. In other words, she starved to death alone, which was something that he carried a tremendous level of grief over and guilt over throughout the rest of his life up until his passing. Following this, just like Grave of the Fireflies, the story and film, Nosaka did cremate his sister in the countryside, obtained a death certificate. However, because his mother Aiko was still alive, he just explained Kiko's death as being a result of the air raids and fire bombings that occurred. Of course, while the film is completely devastating and a film that sat with me for quite a time now, Nosaka's true story to me is even more awful, and there's so many mixed emotions I have in regards to Nosaka's background and his experiences and how he ended up getting to the point to write Grave of the Fireflies. And in reflection, he ends up confessing in a story called The Distance of 50 Steps, "When I think of how my sister wasted away to skin and bones by a process of reverse development that eventually left her too weak to raise her head or even cry, how she died alone, and how there was nothing left of her but ash after she was cremated, I feel that I was too preoccupied with self-preservation. When I found myself in the hell of starvation, I ate her share of food. And in many ways, you almost feel bad for Nosaka because he's essentially still a boy on the cusp of puberty who does not understand how to handle himself or handle what is going on around him. And the horrible things that he had to do or felt that he had to do to survive ultimately impacted the most vulnerable, which was someone like his 2-year-old sister. And I think what's even worse is Nosaka has come to terms with this, or had came to terms with this while he was alive, and bluntly said a lot of things regarding how he conducted himself with his sister and how he felt following his sister dying. And in the interview from An America, Nosaka says, "Honestly speaking, there was also relief that she died and my burden was gone. No one would wake me up in the night like she did with her crying, and I wouldn't have to wander around with a child on my back anymore. I'm very sorry to say this about my sister, but I did have those feelings too. That's why I haven't gone back to my novel to reread it, since I hate that. It's so hypocritical. It must be absolutely true that Seita must have thought of his sister as a burden too." This is one of many instances of Nosaka coming to terms with his sister's death, and not really just coming to terms, but being brutally honest with himself as to how he felt about the circumstance that he was forced into. And one of the things that triggered the writing of Grave of the Fireflies was the birth of Nosaka's daughter, Mao. And when she turned around 2 or so, the same age as Kiko, he ended up going through a bit of a crisis and stating that he had to leave his home and dealt with extreme anxiety. And he ended up having an irrational conviction, as Stahl states, that his daughter Mao would suddenly drop dead. Nosaka states that this anxiety got so bad that he had to leave home for extended periods of time, to the point that he ended up being so distraught by the sight of his daughter that he left home for 3 months, staying at place to place and essentially becoming an alcoholic. And he would continuously have these paranoid fears that Mao would stop breathing and would fear that she would be dying in her sleep. And he eventually ended up having what I would assume would be post-traumatic stress disorder, where he kept having recurring visions of his family and his home going up in flames. And this was something that followed Nosaka throughout his adulthood. But that trauma ended up helping produce one of the greatest and most impactful films that I've ever seen in my life. And I think there's something beautiful about that. And what I mean is the horrors that Nosaka faced throughout his time that influenced the events of Grave of the Fireflies ended up becoming a force of good in the end. And I don't think there's any greater apology that he could have given his sister than that.